Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time to ancient Egypt. Picture yourself walking down a dusty, sun-baked street in the heart of the Nile Valley. The air is thick with the scent of incense, and you can hear the faint sound of priests chanting. In a small sacred chamber, the solemn ritual of mummification is underway. This is a process that would leave anyone who isn't fully prepared for the afterlife trembling. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive this, unless you were fully committed to surviving for thousands of years in a sealed tomb. But hey, no worries, you'll be just fine tonight, lying here in bed. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. The ancient Egyptians were determined to ensure that their loved ones would live forever, even in the afterlife. But there's so much more to it than just wrapping up a body. It was an elaborate process, filled with spiritual significance. It ensured a person's journey into the afterlife would be as smooth as possible. The first mummies weren't carefully embalmed bodies, but natural corpses preserved by the dry desert sands. Mummification became a religious and cultural cornerstone, with elaborate rituals that spanned weeks and even months. The Egyptians believed that a well-preserved body was key to the soul's survival in the afterlife. And you can't just toss a body into the ground and hope for the best, can you? A body left in the heat and dryness of the desert would often end up mummified without any human intervention. While you're at it, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Something tells me we've got quite the international crowd tonight. Now, dim the lights. Mummification, the very word sounds like something out of an eerie ghost story, doesn't it? For the ancient Egyptians, mummification was the final sacred step in a much larger process of ensuring eternal life. While today we associate mummies with tombs and pyramids, the origins of mummification were much humbler. But as Egypt's culture evolved, so did its methods. Historians still argue about the exact origins of mummification. But one thing is clear. It wasn't just about preserving a body for physical reasons. It was a spiritual necessity. And who wouldn't want a bit of that? A chance to live for eternity, surrounded by all the comforts of life? Sounds almost too good to be true. Now, as we slide deeper into the mysteries of ancient Egypt, let's think for a moment about how this whole mummification business came to be. It wasn't always a well-oiled ritual like we imagine today, with skilled embalmers and elaborate ceremonies. When a body was left in the hot, dry sand, it could naturally dehydrate and preserve itself. This is something the Egyptians quickly realized was the key to keeping the body intact for the afterlife. No, the earliest forms of mummification were born from something much simpler and more natural: the desert. This wasn't exactly a luxury process. It was survival, plain and simple. But that's when things got interesting. Of course, once the Egyptians realized how effective the desert sands were at preserving bodies, they began to get a little more creative. You see, early on, mummification was less of an art and more of a practical response to environmental conditions. Others claim it started even earlier, in the pre-dynastic period, when early Egyptians were first beginning to shape their views on life after death. Some bodies were simply left in the sand, while others were buried with little more than some crude wrappings. But this was just the beginning. Over time, mummification became increasingly complex as the Egyptians linked it to their beliefs about the soul and the afterlife. And it wasn't just about the physical body. The Egyptians also believed that by properly preserving the body, they were ensuring the soul would have a place to return to. Historians still argue about exactly when mummification, as we know it, began. Some say it was in the Old Kingdom, around 4,000 years ago. Except, this home would last forever. As time passed, even middle-class Egyptians began to seek out this ritual as a way of ensuring their souls would be well taken care of in the afterlife. Was it about ensuring that the departed soul would always have a home? Or was it more about the living wanting to preserve the legacy of the deceased? Regardless, the shift from natural preservation to purposeful embalming was an essential development. And here is the kicker. Mummification wasn't reserved just for the wealthy and the elite. It became a matter of spiritual necessity rather than status. Though, of course, the finer the mummification, the more likely you were to live in luxury in the next life. The Egyptian pharaohs were the first to fully embrace this practice on a grand scale. At this point, Egypt's rulers were making their mark on the mummification process, so to speak. They commissioned elaborate mummification procedures and massive tombs that reflected their status in life and death. If you think about it, it is a little like making sure you have a cozy home to return to after a long vacation. Historians still debate whether early mummification was done more for the living or for the dead. One thing's for sure, the Egyptians certainly believed that what happened to your body after death was just as important as how you lived. As the process of mummification became more refined, there was a clear focus on the rituals surrounding the body before the embalming even began. Imagine this scene, a bustling Egyptian household, with preparations taking place for the journey of the deceased into the afterlife. They're performing sacred rites to ensure that the soul of the departed is properly honored and that they'll be ready for their transformation into the afterlife. There's incense burning, perhaps even music softly playing in the background as family members and priests gather. Before the actual embalming took place, these rituals were key to setting the right spiritual tone. Without these preparations, the soul would be lost, wandering the underworld forever. The first step in these preparations wasn't about physical preservation at all. It was about ensuring that the soul, the Bai, would be able to travel safely to the afterlife. In Egyptian belief, the body was not just a physical shell, but a vessel for the soul, which needed to be cared for properly to continue its existence beyond death. Some say there were elaborate prayers and ceremonies, while others suggest simpler rites took place, depending on the social status of the deceased. The body had to be treated with reverence and respect, preparing it for the transformative process of becoming a mummy, which would then be protected in the tomb. After all, you might need those sandals for your journey across the underworld. Imagine the irony of a lovely new set of sandals being left at your side for eternity. They performed intricate ceremonies to ensure the soul's safe passage, which often involved the use of sacred oils and incantations. Historians still debate how many rituals were performed before the embalming began. But one thing is clear. Every mummification was intended to make sure the soul had a smooth journey. But one thing we do know. The priests played an enormous role in making sure the mummification went as smoothly as possible. Without them, the process of preparing the deceased for the afterlife would have been impossible. Did priests perform these rituals for spiritual reasons, or was it also about reinforcing their own power and influence in the society of the living? It was customary for the deceased's family to make offerings of food, clothing, and even jewelry. There's also a fascinating little tidbit about the role of family members in these early rituals. These items would be placed alongside the body in the hope that the soul would find comfort and sustenance in the afterlife. It's not quite the sort of afterlife you might expect, but for the ancient Egyptians, it was practical. These preparatory rites were also where the priests came in, taking on the role of spiritual guides to the dead. It wasn't just about the body. It was about making sure everything was ready for the soul to step into the eternal life beyond. But let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how much trust the Egyptians placed in their priests? Historians often argue whether the embalming process was entirely sacred or if it was somewhat of a political tool. Like most ancient rituals, it's hard to say. Now that the rituals have been performed and the body is prepped for its journey, it is time to dive into one of the most fascinating aspects of the mummification process, the heart. In ancient Egyptian culture, the heart was believed to be the seat of the soul and intellect. It wasn't just a physical organ, it was the center of one's being, an essential part of the journey into the afterlife. While we today might think of our brain as the command center of our existence, the Egyptians were absolutely certain that the heart was where everything truly resided. For them, the heart was more than a muscle that pumped blood. It was the keeper of memories, wisdom, and even emotions. This belief meant that, during the mummification process, the heart had to be preserved at all costs. But strangely enough, the heart wasn't always removed. Some suggest that the decision was based on the social rank of the deceased, while others believe it was more about personal choice or religious preference. Either way, the heart was never to be taken lightly. But here's the twist when the embalmers began their work. One of the first tasks was removing the internal organs, including the stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver. The heart was often placed back inside the body after being preserved with special oils. This wasn't a random act. This heart wasn't just for show. In fact, many pharaohs and high-status individuals had their hearts left inside the body, as it was deemed too essential to remove. After all, the heart would need to pass the weighing of the heart ceremony in the afterlife to ensure the soul's purity. This was where things got interesting. Historians still argue about why certain individuals kept their hearts while others had them removed. The heart, meanwhile, had its own special treatment, and the deceased could rest easy knowing their soul was safely carried into the afterlife with all the necessary pieces. But for those who did have their hearts removed, the process was meticulous. Imagine putting your soul's future in the hands of a single organ. But one thing remains clear. The heart was the key to unlocking the afterlife. It's almost like entrusting your life to a simple piece of anatomy. And yet, the Egyptians believed it was more than that, helping them navigate the afterlife and ensuring that they were found worthy during the trial of judgment. It was an essential part of the soul's journey, and the Egyptians believed that it would act as a guide for the deceased. The heart was meant to be light, free from the weight of sin, and pure enough to pass the judgment of Osiris, the god of the afterlife. However, not every mummified body kept its heart. Some pharaohs and important officials had their hearts removed completely. Historians still debate whether this was because the heart was believed to be so central to the afterlife that it needed extra protection, or if it was just more of a symbolic gesture. After all, if the heart was crucial to your afterlife, then why not go the extra mile and make sure it's treated with utmost care? But for the average person, especially those who were in royalty, the heart would likely be removed and placed in a special container known as a canopic jar. The jars were not just for storage. They were intricately designed and often depicted gods that were associated with each organ. As we step back and reflect, it's fascinating how much the Egyptians focused on this organ. The heart was where it all began and ended. Historians still argue about whether the heart was removed purely for preservation, or if there was a deeper spiritual meaning behind this practice. With the heart either preserved or removed, it's time to move on to the next critical step of mummification, the embalming process itself. This is where the real artistry and skill of the embalmers came into play. Imagine a dark, incense-filled room, lit by the soft glow of oil lamps, where the air is thick with the scent of resins and herbs. The embalmers, who were highly trained priests, worked with careful hands, knowing that what they were doing was nothing short of sacred. It wasn't just about preserving a body. It was about ensuring that the soul could safely cross into the afterlife. The first part of the embalming process involved removing the internal organs, those crucial pieces of the body that would otherwise decay and harm the soul's journey. Or was there a deeper spiritual meaning tied to each organ? Some scholars suggest that the lungs were particularly important because they represented the breath of life, the very essence of being. The liver, on the other hand, was associated with the body's vital functions and might have been considered crucial for the soul as endurance in the afterlife. The stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver were all carefully extracted and set aside for preservation. Well, the answer lies in Egypt's belief in immortality. To preserve the body, they needed to make it as impervious to decay as possible. But the liver and lungs? Well, they were typically mummified too, but their fate was often a bit more mysterious. After all, if you're planning on spending eternity in the afterlife, you're going to need your body to last. Some believe the entire body was covered in the salt, while others suggest that embalmers only focused on certain areas, like the abdominal cavity. Either way, the process was slow and deliberate. Every detail mattered. But here is where things start to get interesting. The intestines and stomach were placed in canopic jars, where they would be preserved for the afterlife. Historians still argue over the specific reasons behind preserving these organs in separate jars. Was it simply a practical matter of storage? The idea that every soul, regardless of wealth or position, deserved to live on forever, preserved and protected by the careful hands of the embalmers? But this wasn't just about scientific preservation. It was a deeply spiritual act. The Egyptians believed that the soul could not live on without its physical vessel, and so they took great care in ensuring that the body would stay intact for eternity. Eventually, it wasn't just pharaohs who were preserved for the afterlife, but everyone from craftsmen to merchants. The Egyptians believed that each organ had a specific role to play in the afterlife, but which one held the most significance? Imagine a body, its moisture slowly being drawn out, while the natron worked its magic, drying out every cell and preserving the skin. It wasn't a quick process. It took around 40 days for the natron to do its work. That's right, 40 days. No rush here. After the organs were removed and carefully preserved, the body was next treated with natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture that would help to dehydrate the corpse. This was the real key to preservation. Now you might be wondering, why not just bury the body in the sand, like the natural mummies found by the river? This wasn't just about keeping the body looking nice. It was about ensuring that it would remain intact for thousands of years. Historians still argue about the exact methods used to dry out the body with natron. The goal was to create a body that would endure the test of time, impervious to decay. As we think about all the work that went into the mummification process, it is worth pausing to consider how this labor-intensive procedure might have made its way from the elite classes to the masses. Historians still debate the role that mummification played in Egyptian society. Was it strictly reserved for royalty and priests? Or did common people also have access to this transformative process? One thing's for sure. As Egypt's civilization grew, so did the accessibility of mummification. The careful preservation of the body wasn't just about luxury. It was about making sure that every person, no matter their social status, could cross over into eternity. And when you think about it, isn't that a bit beautiful? It's one of those details that might make you feel a little warm and fuzzy inside. With the body properly dried out and preserved by natron, the next step in the mummification process was one of the most intricate and sacred: the removal of the internal organs. Now, we've already discussed the heart's significance, but the other organs, the lungs, stomach, liver, and intestines, were just as vital to the entire process. In the minds of the ancient Egyptians, these organs were more than just physical parts of the body. They had spiritual significance. Each was carefully removed, treated, and placed in canopic jars to safeguard them for the afterlife. The embalmer, wearing a linen cloth and a ceremonial mask to maintain his purity, would start by making an incision on the left side of the body. This wasn't a simple cut. It had to be done with precision. This was done carefully to ensure that no damage occurred to the body, as the stomach was considered one of the most important organs for the deceased to use in the afterlife. In fact, the Egyptians believed the stomach would help the deceased digest food in the afterlife, ensuring they could partake in the feasts of eternity. This wasn't just about preserving the body. It was about ensuring that the soul had everything it needed to live on. Some scholars suggest that removing the organs helped to prevent the body from decaying too quickly. as they were the first parts to break down. Others argue that it was entirely about the belief in immortality, that each organ had a role to play in ensuring the soul's survival. You wouldn't want to accidentally damage an organ, or, worse yet, upset the gods. This wasn't just about keeping the body clean. It was about honoring each organ's individual role in the spiritual journey. The intestines, though not as revered as the heart, were still seen as essential for the afterlife. And liver, the intestines were also carefully preserved in their own jar. But to the ancient Egyptians, it was an act of spiritual importance, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. Some Egyptologists believe that the intestines were particularly important because they were thought to be the seed of life, responsible for sustaining the soul in the afterlife. Either way, the careful treatment of each organ is a testament to their commitment to ensuring that every part of the body had a place in the eternal journey. The first organ to be removed was often the stomach. The embalming process wasn't just about the body. It was about preparing for the afterlife in a way that no one, no matter their social status, could ignore. After the stomach came the intestines, which were similarly treated and placed in a separate canopic jar. The Egyptians saw the liver as the center of a person's vitality. Its role in digestion and overall health made it crucial for the afterlife. The same care was taken with the lungs, which were also removed, preserved, and placed in their own jar. The lungs were believed to play a role in the afterlife, possibly helping the soul to breathe in the afterlife, but their exact function is still debated among scholars. But what about the liver? Well, the liver was perhaps the most interesting organ to be removed. The liver was often placed in its own canopic jar and treated with oils and resins to ensure that it would last forever. Historians still argue whether the organ preservation process was solely for religious reasons, or if there was a more practical concern at play. Regardless of the reason, the removal and preservation of the organs were key steps in the mummification process. And don't forget about the intestines. While we've often focused on the more high-profile organs like the heart, the Egyptians believed that once a person was embalmed and their organs preserved, they would be ready for their journey to the afterlife, where they could live forever in peace. Now, it might seem odd to us that such a careful ritual was performed to preserve these seemingly mundane organs. The organs weren't just physical. They were part of a larger, divine process that ensured immortality. Historians still argue about whether the Egyptians were overzealous in their preservation efforts, or whether they were simply reflecting their deep beliefs in the afterlife. As the embalming process continues, there is a rather peculiar practice that often goes unnoticed by casual observers of mummification: the removal of the brain. Now, we've already talked about how the Egyptians placed incredible importance on the heart, believing it to be the center of the soul and intellect. But the brain? Well, that's where things get a little strange. The brain was, to put it bluntly, discarded. This process, known as brain extraction, was often done with little care, as the brain was considered, by most standards, irrelevant to the soul's journey into the afterlife. Yes, it was removed during the embalming process, and in many cases, thrown away. Some scholars suggest that they simply didn't understand its importance, as it wasn't involved in the functions they valued, most like feeling and emotion, which they linked to the heart. Imagine the scene. The embalmer, carefully working to preserve the body, would insert a long hooked instrument through the nostrils to pull out the brain. Unlike in modern times, where we associate the brain with thought, memory, and intelligence, the Egyptians believed that these qualities resided in the heart, not the brain. Why, you ask? Well, the Egyptians didn't exactly see the brain as the seat of consciousness or intellect. After all, if the brain didn't play a role in the afterlife, why preserve it? Especially the heart. The Egyptians didn't abandon the entire idea of mental faculties. They simply placed more importance on the spiritual journey. So, the embalmers would remove it, usually through the nose, and discard it. The preservation of the soul was far more important than the preservation of the physical brain. The brain might have been removed and discarded, but the soul would live on, forever in the afterlife, with some suggesting it was linked to Egyptian religious beliefs, while others think it was simply a matter of practicality. Either way, it's clear that the ancient Egyptians had their own unique worldview when it came to life, death, and the afterlife, ready to enjoy the eternal life it deserved. Historians still argue over why the Egyptians didn't care much for the brain. Others believe that the brain was viewed as something less spiritually significant, especially since we now know that the brain is responsible for nearly all cognitive functions. Why bother with the brain when we've got the heart to guide the soul? It's an interesting viewpoint, and one that sets ancient Egypt apart from other cultures in terms of their beliefs about the body and the soul. But in ancient Egypt, they had their own spiritual logic. They didn't simply toss everything out. They treated the organs and body with reverence and precision. But here's the fascinating part. Even though the brain was discarded, the Egyptians still showed incredible care and attention to the rest of the body. The brain might have been left behind, but the body as a whole was seen as essential for the soul's journey. What's even more surprising is that this practice wasn't universal across Egypt. Some mummies, particularly those of high-ranking individuals, did have their brains preserved in some way. But these cases were rare. Most commoners, or even some middle-class Egyptians, didn't have the luxury of keeping their brain intact. This reinforces the idea that the Egyptians saw the brain as insignificant compared to the other organs. There's another interesting point to consider. While the brain may have been discarded, to them, some modern scholars find this rejection of the brain puzzling. Perhaps they figured historians still debate why the brain was so disregarded. And that worldview didn't include the brain as we understand it today. Once the brain had been discarded, the body was set to undergo a crucial stage of the mummification process, desiccation. Now, by this point, you might be wondering just how the Egyptians kept their mummies so well preserved. The answer is natron. This naturally occurring salt mixture made up of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and sodium chloride was key to keeping the body dry and preserved. The Egyptians understood that moisture was the enemy of preservation, and they didn't take any chances. Imagine the scene: a room filled with natron, the body laid out in the midst of the salt, with every part of it being carefully coated to draw out moisture. But beneath the surface, everything was changing. Every drop of water in the body was slowly drawn out, leaving a preserved shell behind. The flesh would dry out and shrink, but the skin would remain, tough and leathery, holding the form of the deceased. For 40 days, the body would lie there, gradually drying out as the natron worked its magic. So, while natron was helping to preserve the body of the deceased, it was also a part of the Egyptians' daily life. The skin had shriveled, the muscles had hardened, and the body was as dry as a raisin in the sun. This wasn't just about the physical body, it was about ensuring that the soul could live on forever. Some suggest that the embalmers used heat to help dry the body faster, while others argue that the process was completely natural, relying solely on the heat of the Egyptian desert and the magic of natron. But this was exactly what the embalmers wanted. The mummified body was now in the perfect condition to withstand the test of time. This wasn't a rushed job. The Egyptians were meticulous, taking the time to ensure that everything was just right before moving forward. They understood its power long before the time of mummification, and used it in all sorts of ways. Imagine how strange it must have looked, a body that was dry, but still retaining its shape, as if it were merely sleeping. Imagine that, a body so perfectly preserved that it could outlast even the most powerful civilizations. Historians still debate whether the embalmers took extra steps to preserve the body beyond just using natron. The body, no matter what happened in the world around it, would remain. Did they know about bacteria and decay? Or was it all just instinct and ritual? It wasn't just about preserving flesh. It was about ensuring that the soul had a place to return to forever. Some believed that additional oils or resins were rubbed into the skin, which helped maintain the mummified look. What we do know is that natron was essential to the process. It helped stop the body from decaying. The Egyptians also used it in their daily lives for a variety of purposes. It was used to make soap, for cleaning, and even for some medicinal purposes, allowing it to last for thousands of years and ultimately providing the necessary base for all the other embalming techniques to work. There are even some who think that the embalmers used aromatic substances to mask the smell of decay, though there's no definitive proof of this. But here's an interesting tidbit. Natron wasn't just used for mummification. In fact, the word natron comes from the Egyptian word ntr, which refers to the substance's use in both ritual and practical settings. But back to the mummification process. After 40 days of drying, the body was completely desiccated. The Egyptians had learned that to preserve the body for eternity, it needed to be dried out, as moisture was the main culprit behind decomposition. Historians still argue about the exact methods used to speed up the drying process. Regardless, we know that the body had to stay in the natron for a considerable amount of time before the next stage could begin. The drying process was so thorough that once the body had been properly desiccated, it could survive for thousands of years without major decomposition. In a sense, the Egyptians had cracked the code to immortality. Historians still argue over whether the Egyptians fully understood the science behind dehydration, or whether it was purely a spiritual process. We may never know. But what we do know is that their methods were highly effective, and that natron was the secret ingredient to their success. Now that the body has been thoroughly dried and preserved, the next step is one of the most delicate and sacred parts of the mummification process: wrapping the body in linen. But this wasn't just about throwing a few strips of cloth over a body. No, this was an intricate, highly symbolic process that took time and expertise. The embalmers, working carefully and reverently, would begin the long process of wrapping the body, layer by layer, ensuring that every part of the deceased was covered. Every fold, every twist of the linen was intended to protect the soul in the afterlife, ensuring that the body would be whole and intact as the soul journeyed through eternity. This wasn't just any ordinary cloth. It was part of a sacred process, woven with care and precision. Think of it like a very elaborate and solemn version of wrapping a present, except this present was meant to last for thousands of years. Each piece of cloth was cut to fit the body, with no section left uncovered. Along with the linen, amulets and other magical items were placed on the body, inside the wrappings, to safeguard the deceased on their journey to the afterlife. The linen used in the mummification process was of high quality, often imported from distant lands. In many ways, some say they were placed in very specific locations, such as around the neck or the chest, while others suggest that the amulets were scattered throughout the wrappings. The goal, however, was always the same: to provide the deceased with a shield against the dangers they might face on their journey to the afterlife. Was just as much about providing spiritual protection as it was about keeping the body intact. The body would be wrapped from head to toe in a series of layers, each one designed to preserve the body and protect the soul. But here's the catch. The wrapping wasn't just about physical protection. It was also about spiritual protection. Each layer of linen was carefully placed. The body was slowly transformed into something that wasn't quite human anymore, but a vessel for the soul. Scholars believe that the complexity of the wrapping process was meant to demonstrate the deceased's social status. After all, only the wealthy could afford such elaborate treatments. But whatever the reasons, there's no denying the importance of the wrapping in ensuring the soul's safe passage, ready for the afterlife, often with the aid of a priest or embalmer, and secured with resin or other adhesives to ensure that it stayed in place. These amulets, often inscribed with spells or prayers, were believed to offer protection from evil spirits and to help the deceased pass through various trials in the afterlife. Depending on the complexity of the mummification, these little magical items were placed in the folds of the linen or within the body, ensuring that no part of the deceased's body was left unprotected. Some mummies were wrapped in as many as 20 layers of linen. Was it a purely spiritual act, or were there practical considerations as well? Did the wrappings serve a symbolic function, or were they mainly there to prevent decay? Imagine how much time and effort it took to create this elaborate wrapping. It wasn't just about the body, it was about ensuring that everything, down to the smallest detail, was just right. The use of amulets in mummification is one of those fascinating aspects of Egyptian culture that reveals just how deeply intertwined the physical and spiritual worlds were. The ancient Egyptians didn't just rely on physical preservation. They used magic, ritual, and prayer to ensure that the soul would have a safe journey after death. The wrapping of the body, historians still argue about the exact placement of the amulets. As you imagine the scene, the embalmers carefully wrapping the body, placing amulets inside the folds, securing each layer with precision. It's easy to see why this process was so sacred. And let's not forget about the intricate nature of the wrapping itself. The process wasn't just about functionality. It was an art. This wasn't a quick process. Wrapping a body could take weeks. In fact, and with each layer of linen, historians still debate how much influence religion had over the wrapping process. So, it wasn't just about preserving the body for the afterlife. It was about protecting the soul, making sure that everything was just right for the journey ahead. As the body was carefully wrapped in linen, with every inch covered and every amulet placed strategically, the process of preparing the deceased for the afterlife was nearing its final stages. But before the mummy was sealed away in its tomb, there were still a few crucial rituals to complete, which would ensure the deceased was fully equipped for the journey ahead. These final rituals, often involving more than one priest, were as important as any of the steps taken during the mummification process itself. This was a powerful ritual in which priests would perform symbolic acts to restore the deceased's ability to speak, eat, and breathe in the afterlife, and faculties to engage in the activities of eternal life, things like feasting and participating in the pleasures of the gods. The opening of the mouth ceremony would symbolically activate the mummy, ensuring that the deceased could continue to enjoy all the joys of the afterlife. They would provide the final protection for the soul and ensure that the body would remain untouched for eternity. One of the key moments in the final phase of mummification was the opening of the mouth ceremony. These prayers were carefully crafted to ensure that the soul would be protected from evil spirits and other dangers lurking in the underworld. This act was meant to restore the deceased's ability to speak, hear, and see in the afterlife. Some believe that only the most important individuals, like pharaohs, received the full ceremony with all the accompanying prayers. Others suggest that even the lower classes, although their rituals may have been less ornate, still participated in some form of the opening of the mouth ceremony and prayers. But for the Egyptians, it was an essential act of revival, one that ensured that the body wasn't just preserved physically, but also spiritually awakened for the journey ahead. The ancient Egyptians believed that in the afterlife, the deceased would need their senses. The soul was believed to continue to exist in the afterlife, interacting with the gods and navigating through the various challenges and tests of the underworld. Without these rituals, the soul would be lost and could never find its place among the gods. To perform the ceremony, the priest would use a ritual tool, often resembling an adze or a special knife, to touch the mummy's mouth and eyes. They didn't just see death as the end, they saw it as a continuation of life, one that could be just as rich and full as the life they had left behind, ensuring that the soul would be able to continue its journey in peace. The mummification process was their way of ensuring that, no matter what, they would always be prepared for that journey. Were they designed to impress the gods with their opulence? Or were they merely practical shelters, meant to keep the body safe There were also the final prayers and incantations, which were intended to ensure the soul's protection as it made its way into the afterlife. The priests, with reverence and solemnity, would place the mummy into its final resting place, a stone sarcophagus or a wooden coffin, sealing it away for eternity. And even servants. The Egyptians believed that the tomb would serve as the final home for the deceased, where they would rest for eternity, surrounded by all the comforts of life. It's a little surreal to think about it. A priest standing over a mummy, delicately touching its mouth, believing that this act would bring the soul back to life in the next world. But the opening of the mouth wasn't the only ritual performed at this stage. The embalming priests, who had already worked tirelessly to prepare the body, would chant spells and recite prayers, calling upon the gods to provide safety and shelter for the deceased. Historians still argue over how elaborate these final rituals were. Either way, these final steps were considered vital for the soul's survival and happiness in the afterlife. Interestingly, this ceremony was not just for the mummified body, it was for the soul as well. It's easy to see why these final moments of mummification were considered sacred and profoundly important. As the final ritual concluded, the body would be ready for its tomb. The tomb itself, designed to house the body and its treasures, was not just a place for physical rest. It was also a gateway to the afterlife. Historians still debate whether these tombs were more about luxury or practicality. The truth is likely a bit of both. The tombs were incredibly elaborate, often filled with everything the deceased might need in the afterlife: food, clothes, furniture. In a way, it's hard not to admire the Egyptians' belief in the afterlife. Their belief in the afterlife was a reflection of their hope that life would go on forever, in a place where they would be eternally cared for by the gods. Now, as the mummification process nears its end, and the body is sealed away in its final resting place, we can't ignore one of the most enduring aspects of ancient Egyptian beliefs: the afterlife. For the Egyptians, the afterlife wasn't just some abstract concept. It was a detailed, tangible reality, one that would shape every step of the mummification process. From the carefully placed amulets to the elaborate tombs, everything was designed to ensure the soul's safe passage to the next world. But what exactly did this afterlife look like? To enter the Duat, the soul had to pass through a series of trials, each one more difficult than the last. The ancient Egyptians believed in a place called the Duat, the underworld, which was both a place of danger and rebirth. It was here that the deceased would face the judgment of Osiris, the god of the afterlife. In a dramatic ritual, the heart of the deceased would be weighed against the feather of Mate, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul would pass into the afterlife. The soul's fate was intricately tied to the state of the body. If the body decayed, the soul might not be able to pass the judgment. Regardless of the specific view, the belief in a rich and fulfilling afterlife permeated every aspect of Egyptian culture. The ancient Egyptians believed that, providing everything necessary for eternal peace. It wasn't just a simple burial. It was a carefully constructed gateway to a life beyond death. In the afterlife, the soul would be reunited with the gods and granted a peaceful, eternal existence. Did the elite class use the afterlife as a way to reinforce their status, or was it more about genuine religious belief? This is why the tombs of the pharaohs were often filled with everything they might need: food, and through the elaborate mummification process, they believed they had found the key to achieving it. While others argue that they were a reflection of a deep spiritual commitment to life after death, clothing and their elaborate mummification practices were a direct reflection of this, something that shaped every aspect of Egyptian society, from politics to art to daily life. They didn't just want to live well on earth, they wanted to live forever, in a place where they could enjoy eternal peace and comfort. Furniture and even servants. But if it was heavier, weighed down by the sins of life, the soul would be devoured by Ammit, the terrifying monster with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hind legs of a hippopotamus. It is easy to see why the ancient Egyptians placed so much importance on ensuring that the body was perfectly preserved, often filled with beautiful murals and carvings that depicted scenes from the deceased's life, as well as representations of gods, animals, and the afterlife. Some argue that the afterlife was seen as a continuation of earthly life, where the deceased would enjoy the same pleasures they had on earth, but with the added benefit of eternal life. Idea as the body lay in its tomb, carefully preserved and wrapped in linen, the soul would begin its journey through the Duat, hoping to be found worthy by Osiris, the god of the afterlife. If successful, the soul would enter the field of reeds, a paradise where they could live forever in peace, surrounded by the beauty of nature and the blessings of the gods. Was that these images would help the soul navigate the challenges of the Duat and provide comfort on the journey. The tombs were designed to serve as both a final resting place and a spiritual home, ensuring that the soul would always have a place to return to. The embalming process, the placement of amulets, and the rituals performed during mummification all had one purpose: to prepare the soul for this final crucial test. Historians still debate how the Egyptians viewed the afterlife. Others believe that the afterlife was more of a spiritual existence, where the soul would live in peace with the gods, free from earthly concerns. But it wasn't just about judgment and fear. The Egyptians believed that these items would ensure the soul's comfort in the afterlife. The tombs themselves were incredible works of art and architecture. The historians still argue about how much the belief in the afterlife influenced the social structure of Egypt. Some scholars believe that the elaborate tombs and mummification practices were used to display wealth and power. One thing is certain: the ancient Egyptians were deeply invested in the idea of immortality. The idea of the afterlife wasn't just a religious belief, it was a cultural imperative. And so, this was the ultimate goal for the ancient Egyptians: eternal life, a life beyond death. Now that the body has been sealed away in its tomb, and the soul is set on its journey to the afterlife, it's important to recognize the deeper, almost mystical symbolism that mummification represented. For the ancient Egyptians, mummification wasn't just about preserving the body, it was a means of transformation. The embalming process, from the removal of organs to the wrapping in linen, was an act of alchemy, where the deceased was not just preserved, but prepared for a new form of existence. The mummy was both a vessel and a sacred object, something that could bridge the gap between the world of the living and the world of the dead. These places were meant to ensure that the soul would have all the comforts it enjoyed in life, now magnified in the divine realm. The tomb was a microcosm of the world, meant to mirror the comforts and experiences of life on earth. Think about the great pyramids and tombs scattered across Egypt. The Egyptians believed that their gods could offer them eternal protection, but they also believed that the gods themselves could be the ultimate judges of their worthiness for the afterlife. It was entering a trial, a series of challenges meant to test the soul's purity and its ability to navigate the dangers of the underworld. Imagine, your body is sealed away, wrapped in linen, carefully embalmed, and placed in a tomb, but your soul still has to face judgment. These structures weren't just elaborate graves. They were designed to be gateways to the afterlife, places where the deceased could continue to interact with the divine and the spiritual realm. The tombs themselves, filled with treasures, food, and beautiful murals depicting the deceased's life, serve as a type of cosmic home. This relationship was tested in the afterlife through the weighing of the heart. If the heart was pure, the soul would enter paradise. If it was heavy, burdened by guilt, it would be devoured by Emmet, the monster with the crocodile head. Everyone, from the pharaoh to the humble worker, was entitled to a chance at immortality. As the mummification process became more widespread, it wasn't just about the elite. It was about the collective belief in immortality, which extended to every individual in Egyptian society. The idea that death was not the end, but a transition to another life, was universal. Historians suggest that while the pharaohs and nobles received the most elaborate mummification, commoners weren't entirely left out. Did the belief in immortality serve to reinforce the social hierarchy, or did it unite the people in their shared hope for eternal life? And mummification was the means by which they ensured their souls would live on forever. Over time, as mummification techniques became more refined and accessible, even those of lower social standing could access these practices, albeit in a simpler form. The heart, which had been carefully preserved and kept inside the body, was thought to carry the weight of the soul's sins and virtues. Some see it as a spiritual journey, while others view it as a social and political tool. There is a long-standing debate about whether these tombs and mummification practices were used more for the glorification of the ruling class, or if they were truly driven by religious beliefs about the afterlife. Some argue that it represents the essence of human emotion and decision-making, while others suggest that it's more about the soul's spiritual purity. Regardless, it's clear that the Egyptians believed that the soul was directly linked to the heart, and that this judgment was the final test for entering the afterlife. Historians still argue about how the mummification process tied into these beliefs. Either way, one thing is for certain: mummification was an essential practice for ensuring that the deceased could continue to thrive in the afterlife. But perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects of Egyptian mummification lies in its relationship with the gods. When the soul entered the do-it, it wasn't just walking into some celestial waiting room. The idea that one's fate in the afterlife was tied so directly to the gods is fascinating. The Egyptians didn't just rely on physical preservation for eternal life. They also relied on their spiritual relationship with the gods. In the afterlife, it would be weighed against Matsi's feather, symbolizing truth and justice. Historians still debate the significance of the heart's role in this judgment. The mummification process, therefore, wasn't just about preserving the body. It was about ensuring that the heart, the essence of the soul, could be weighed fairly and truthfully. But what about the common people? Were they also afforded these elaborate funerary practices? Or was this reserved only for the elite? For the Egyptians, ensuring that every soul had a chance at eternal life was essential. Even in the tombs of the commoners, simple mummification methods were employed, and offerings were made to ensure a safe passage into the afterlife. Historians still argue about how this belief in the afterlife influenced Egyptian society as a whole. Perhaps it was a bit of both. Regardless, one thing is certain: the afterlife was central to Egyptian life. As we move deeper into the understanding of mummification, it's important to note how the Egyptians' meticulous practices have influenced modern practices and beliefs. The fascination with ancient Egyptian mummies has remained constant over centuries, from the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb to the widespread cultural impact of Egyptian imagery in modern media. Even today, the legacy of mummification and the afterlife continues to captivate us. The idea that a body could survive for thousands of years seemed almost magical, and in a way, it was. The sheer effectiveness of the mummification process spoke to the Egyptians' deep understanding of preservation and their commitment to immortality. But how much of this fascination stems from historical truth, and how much of it has been shaped by myth and pop culture? Some suggest that the deaths were simply the result of bad luck, while others argue that the perceived curse was a way for ancient Egyptian religion to be reinterpreted by modern minds. When mummies were first discovered by explorers and archaeologists, the world was struck by their preservation. The curse played on the very idea that these bodies were not just physical remains. They were vessels imbued with ancient power, waiting to exact their vengeance on the living. While modern embalming is less spiritual and more focused on practical concerns, the roots of the practice can be traced directly back to ancient Egypt. In a sense, the Egyptians were centuries ahead of their time, using natural resources and a deep understanding of biology to achieve the goal of preservation. Yet, as mummies began to be unearthed, they also became the subject of strange and sensationalized tales. Some scholars believe that the Egyptians had a highly developed knowledge of human biology, while others suggest that their techniques were largely based on religious beliefs and rituals. Ancient Egyptians were, in many ways, pioneers in the art of preserving bodies. The processes they used, including the preservation of organs and the wrapping of the body, laid the groundwork for modern embalming techniques. The idea of preserving the body for eternity and the rituals surrounding death can be found in other ancient civilizations as well. The mummy's curse, for example, became a popular myth surrounding the discovery of royal tombs, particularly King Tut's tomb, where several individuals involved in the excavation died under mysterious circumstances. In many ways, the Egyptians viewed death not with sorrow, but with hope and reverence for what was to come. Some view it as an expression of the Egyptians' deep religious beliefs, while others see it as a practical response to the harsh desert environment, where preservation of the body became a necessity. Whether it's the allure of a well-preserved body, the mystery of the afterlife, or the scientific curiosity about ancient preservation methods, mummies continue to capture the imagination. The mummy was a symbol of this belief, a physical representation of the soul as potential for eternal life, a deep respect for the deceased, and a desire to ensure that life would continue even in death. The discovery of mummies continues to awe and intrigue us, and their preservation serves as a testament to the ancient Egyptians' understanding of life, death, and the eternal. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not an end, but a continuation of life in a different realm. While their methods differed from those of the Egyptians, the common thread of preserving the body for the afterlife was present. Across the world, cultures have sought to ensure that the dead would be well prepared for whatever awaited them in the afterlife, whether through elaborate tombs, offerings, or mummification. Whether the curse was real or simply the result of coincidence, it helped to cement the mystery and allure of mummification in modern culture. Historians still debate how much truth there is to the notion of a mummy's curse. Regardless, the concept of a curse only added to the mystique of ancient Egypt and the mummies that were preserved for eternity. But beyond the myths, mummification has left a lasting legacy in the world of modern medicine and science. Today, embalming is a common practice in funeral homes across the world, where bodies are carefully preserved for display or burial. The use of natron in mummification was also an early form of chemical preservation, which we now know helps prevent the growth of bacteria and fungi. In modern embalming, chemicals like formaldehyde and glutaraldehyde are used to stop decomposition, but the basic principle remains the same: preservation for the future. Historians still debate whether ancient Egypt's mummification techniques were the result of trial and error, or if they were based on an advanced understanding of anatomy and preservation. Regardless, it's clear that the Egyptians' commitment to preserving the dead was not only a matter of religious significance, but also an impressive scientific achievement for its time. Moreover, mummification didn't only influence modern embalming practices, it also influenced other cultures. For example, the ancient Peruvians, particularly the Inca civilization, also practiced mummification. In addition to its scientific and cultural influence, mummification has also shaped our perceptions of death. This belief in life after death can be seen in the tombs, offerings, and elaborate preparations for the journey into the afterlife. Historians still argue about the spiritual significance of mummification. Regardless of the reasons, the Egyptians' practices ensured that their legacy would endure. The fascination with mummification is not likely to fade anytime soon. As we learn more about ancient Egypt, we find that the practice of mummification was about much more than just preservation. It was about a profound belief in the afterlife. As we move closer to the end of our journey into the world of ancient Egyptian mummification, we come to one of the most enduring and fascinating aspects of the practice: The role of mummies in modern-day culture. While the ancient Egyptians practiced mummification for spiritual and religious reasons, the discovery of mummies over the centuries has provided us with a unique window into the past. These preserved bodies have become more than just artifacts of death. They are symbols of endurance, mystery, and the Egyptians' devotion to immortality. From ancient tales about the great tombs of Egypt to Hollywood blockbusters like The Mummy, mummies have become iconic figures in storytelling. While there is no evidence to suggest that the Egyptians saw their tombs as cursed, in modern archaeology, mummies are invaluable sources of historical data. The preservation of mummies allows scientists and historians to study the ancient world in a way that would otherwise be impossible. From the analysis of embalming techniques to the insights they provide into ancient diets, diseases, and medical practices, mummies have taught us more than we could have ever imagined about life in ancient Egypt. Mummification represents humanity's desire to conquer death, to preserve life in some form, even after the body has decayed. And to find ways to honor the dead is as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. In many ways, the ancient Egyptians were the original immortality seekers, striving to find ways to preserve not only the body, but the soul itself for eternity. For instance, researchers have found evidence of ancient illnesses like arthritis and tuberculosis in the bones of mummies, as well as traces of ancient medicines used in their embalming. The idea of a curse surrounding a sealed tomb may have emerged later as a result of the dramatic discoveries of royal tombs in the 1800s. So what was once seen as a mysterious and almost mystical practice is now a key element of our understanding of one of the world's oldest and most influential civilizations. Advances in DNA extraction have allowed scientists to study the genetic makeup of mummies, providing us with insight into the biological history of ancient Egyptians. And the modern one, keeping the story of Egypt alive in ways that few other practices could. Their continued preservation, study, and depiction in popular culture ensure that the fascination with mummification will endure for generations to come. In one famous example, researchers were able to extract DNA from the mummy of Pharaoh Ramses II, which provided clues about his health, including evidence of dental disease and other conditions. These scientific findings are reshaping our understanding of ancient Egyptian life in ways that we never thought possible. When tombs were opened, particularly in the case of King Tutankhamun, a series of deaths and mishaps among the people involved led to the rise of the curse myth. The Egyptian collection at the British Museum or the Museum of Egyptian Antiquities in Cairo includes countless mummies, along with the artifacts that accompany them, offering visitors a glimpse into the fascinating world of ancient Egypt. Some believe that the display of mummies in museums may violate the cultural and spiritual beliefs of the ancient Egyptians, while others argue that these exhibitions serve as an important educational tool, helping people to understand and appreciate ancient cultures. Either way, it is clear that mummies hold an important place in the collective consciousness of both scholars and the general public. These exhibitions serve as reminders of a civilization that, while long gone, left behind a legacy that still resonates with us today. Newspapers and writers of the time fed into the idea, creating a narrative of ancient revenge that continues to captivate audiences today. In many of these stories, mummies are depicted as cursed or vengeful spirits, brought back to life to wreak havoc on the living. This pop culture portrayal of mummies often leans into the myth of the mummy's curse, a concept that, while rooted in the deaths of those associated with ancient tombs, is more a product of 19th and 20th century imagination than ancient Egyptian belief. And though the physical process of mummification has faded from modern practice, the fascination with mummies continues to thrive in pop culture, archaeology, and our collective imagination. One of the most obvious ways mummies have remained in the public consciousness is through literature and film. Historians still debate how much the ancient Egyptians believed in the idea of curses related to tombs and mummies. But the fascination with mummies goes far beyond the realms of fiction. The study of mummies also extends into the world of genetics. On a cultural level, the display of mummies in museums around the world is another way in which mummification continues to captivate the public. Historians still argue whether these modern-day exhibitions of mummies and ancient artifacts are an appropriate reflection of respect for the deceased or whether they represent a commercialization of the sacred. The use of mummies in popular culture and as scientific tools speaks to a larger human desire to understand what happens after death and to connect with our distant ancestors. And while we may no longer wrap our dead in linen and embalming fluids, the quest to understand life after death, as we reflect on the legacy of mummification, we also have to acknowledge how it has changed our perception of ancient Egypt. The mummies, preserved through ancient rituals, have become much more than relics. They are the link between the ancient world. And now, we come to the final chapter of our journey as we reflect on the legacy of mummification and how it continues to shape our understanding of ancient Egypt, death, and immortality. The mummified bodies of ancient Egyptians are not merely relics of a long-gone civilization. They are enduring symbols of the Egyptians' beliefs, their understanding of the human body, and their hope for life beyond death. These mummies serve as a connection between the living and the dead, a link that transcends time and speaks to our shared human desire for immortality. It was about preparing for an eternal existence, ensuring that the soul would have a safe and prosperous journey to the afterlife. Mummification was a profound spiritual act, one rooted in the Egyptians' belief in the soul as immortality and the sacredness of life after death. The Egyptians saw mummification as a means of ensuring that they would live on, remembered by future generations. In many ways, the tombs and mummies acted as time capsules, preserving not only the bodies of the dead, but their personal stories, their rituals, and their beliefs. The process was complex, requiring skilled priests and embalmers to carry out the intricate procedures. Their attention to detail was a testament to their devotion to the afterlife, as well as their scientific and artistic capabilities. Today, we still practice embalming, though for more practical purposes. The legacy of mummification has also inspired modern preservation techniques in medicine, such as organ preservation and body donation. These advancements, though rooted in different motivations, are a testament to the enduring impact of ancient Egyptian practices. It wasn't just about wrapping bodies in linen. It was about using a deep understanding of the human body and preservation techniques to achieve immortality. Regardless of where we stand on this debate, it is clear that their mummification practices were more than just ritualistic. They were deeply intertwined with their spiritual beliefs. I'd feel a sense of awe at the devotion and care the Egyptians showed for the dead. In a world that often views death as the end, they saw it as a continuation, a new phase of existence. Their belief in the eternal life of the soul is something that continues to resonate with us today, reminding us of the power of faith, ritual, and a desire for immortality. The act of mummification was an extraordinary cultural practice that went far beyond the simple goal of preserving a body. The ancient Egyptians may have been long gone, but their legacy, preserved in the mummies they left behind, continues to inspire and fascinate us. Through their practices, their beliefs, and their dedication to the afterlife, they've given us a glimpse into a world that once was, and one that endures in our collective consciousness. It was about ensuring that the soul could continue to exist, surrounded by the comforts of the world it left behind. Through this elaborate process, the ancient Egyptians believed they could secure eternal life, not just for the pharaohs and the wealthy, but for anyone who underwent the rituals. Mummification was the beginning of a new chapter, a new life in a realm that was just as real and important as the one they had left behind. We are witnessing a cultural phenomenon that transcends millennia, reminding us of the Egyptian commitment to honoring their dead and ensuring their continued existence in the afterlife. The mummies of Egypt are more than just physical remains. They are symbols of hope, faith, and the enduring human desire to overcome death. Today, when we look at mummies, we are not just looking at physical bodies preserved by natron in linen. But mummification wasn't just about preserving the body. It was about preserving a legacy. These tombs, filled with offerings, paintings, and inscriptions, were not just designed to house the dead. They were designed to preserve the essence of life itself, ensuring that the deceased's memory would endure. Mummification also highlights the Egyptian commitment to knowledge and precision. The Egyptians demonstrated an extraordinary level of craftsmanship, from the careful removal of organs to the meticulous wrapping of the body. Even though the ancient Egyptians are no longer with us, their belief in immortality, the afterlife, and the preservation of the body continues to influence modern ideas about death. Historians still debate the full extent of the Egyptians' understanding of the afterlife, and whether they viewed death as an ultimate spiritual journey or as just another phase of life. To the Egyptians, death was not an end, but a transformation. In the end, mummification was not just about preserving the body for the afterlife. It was about preserving the essence of life itself. The tombs, the rituals, the amulets, and the mummies were all part of this sacred process, meant to help the deceased find peace, prosperity, and immortality in the afterlife. As we finish this journey through the world of ancient Egyptian mummification, we can to help now, as you settle back into the present moment, reflect on the mysteries and rituals that still capture our imaginations.